All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Under Discussion. My name is Jack Crowell, and I will be your moderator this evening with the magnificent Dr. Bridget Marshall. We are discussing her book, Industrial Gothic, and then I want to get the subtitle correct. Industrial Gothic, Workers, Exploitation and Urbanization in Transatlantic 19th Century Literature. Very pithy, that subtitle. Some housekeeping up top. If at any point you would like to or need to use the restroom, just follow the signs where back around the curtain here. You can search us, or you can find us at LTC Lowell Mass, or MA, Lowell MA, to find us on social media. And if you like what you see, turn off the TV and share it. We are excited to be here. This is the first time I myself am hosting or rather moderating, I'll say, the Under Discussion. And I'm absolutely honored to be here with Bridget Marshall. So I'd like to say hello. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Also my first time here. So.
Brilliant. And many more.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with just saying, okay, can we get to know you a little bit? Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Bridget Marshall. I'm an English professor at UMass Lowell. Right now I teach a course on disability and literature. I came here starting to teach Gothic literature and kind of went off in some other directions. My graduate work was on Gothic novels, and I looked specifically at law and legal issues. And I don't know, maybe I'm jumping a little ahead to tell you how I ended up with this book, which is...
No, you're honestly saving me the trouble.
Okay. But I came to Lowell and looked around at all this architecture, and I said, wow, this is a really Gothic place in a different way. And then I worked over at the Songus Industrial History Center with some of their K-12 workshops that they do for teachers, that they do for K-12 teachers. And in doing just getting to know Lowell, because I was a new resident, the more I learned, the more Gothic it seemed to me. And so literally getting this job at UMass Lowell and moving to Lowell set me on this whole other track and resulted in writing a book. It's a danger of moving to a new place. You might just accidentally write a book.
There's the danger of noticing things.
Yes.
You're like, how about that? Well, fantastic. Well, so we will be talking about your book, Industrial Gothic. I was wondering if you would just give us a general thesis for the book. What?
Yeah. Sure. Oh, gosh. Let me open to the third page. So in Industrial Gothic, I argue that the Gothic novel, which is a long-standing genre dating back to the 1760s or so, sort of experienced a regeneration and a redefinition in the period of the Industrial Revolution. And it happens in both England and America, where we see people are looking at the darkness and creepiness of industrial settings, factories and mills in particular, and understanding these as Gothic places, and then writing fiction and nonfiction, poems, all sorts of genres that sort of look at that darkness and use all of the tropes of Gothic novels to express them.
Well, I gotta say, I was really nerding out when I was reading this book, which is a very, I feel, English professor response to have to, look, this new literary criticism I'm not familiar with already. That's fantastic. But as a resident of Lowell and a fan of Gothic literature, I was like, this book feels kind of perfect for me selfishly. So I was really interested in sort of the standard, it seems, in a lot of Gothic scholarship, that people kind of need to define what they mean by Gothic. And this is something that I see, or like one sees in a lot of different disciplines. Like I used to study young adult literature. And if you study young adult literature long enough, you see at the beginning of every paper, everyone's like, okay, what do we mean? What do we mean? What are we talking about here?
Define your terms.
So if you would tell us how you define Gothic literature or the Gothic for a sort of base us to jump off of.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm guessing you all out there have an idea of what a Gothic novel is or what the Gothic is. You have kind of like a dark, creepy idea. I'm seeing some people trying not to make eye contact because you're afraid I'm going to call on you. I won't, but maybe I will. So that's the fear, right? That bit of anxiety. So I think there's definitely anxiety and fear right at the heart of the Gothic. Classic Gothic starts, I think, most commonly with a woman in peril. That is kind of the beating heart, that you've got a girl, the girl in danger, right? And she is typically in danger at the hands of a man, and that man has power, wealth, possibly is related to her as her father or someone else. So we see a gender dynamic right at the heart of a lot of the Gothic. So fear, power, and also a creepy setting. So places like castles historically, churches as well, and then, as I argue, Gothic architecture like factories, big imposing buildings that might make people anxious when they look at them from the outside because they wonder what's going on inside there. But they're also big imposing buildings that represent power as well. So a castle or a church represent religious or state power, right? And likewise, factories represent economic as well as social power. And so all those things together, I think, factor into the Gothic. Horace Walpole wrote Castle of Otranto, 1764. I'm hoping I'm getting that date right. Checking me on that.
Now I'm going to
Wikipedia,
trust you
check.
implicitly.
Nearly certain that's it, because so he writes the first novel, and he says this is a Gothic novel, and then everyone else is sort of chasing after him and doing different variations on it. Some folks think the true Gothic happens from like 1764 to maybe 1800 or 1820, maybe 1824, and then it stops abruptly, and then maybe starts up again in the late 19th century, like looking at Dracula. But there's like a missing chunk in the middle, and I would argue that the things that I'm studying, these factory Gothic novels, these stories of factory girls in peril, fill that gap and let us move from, say, Frankenstein, which we readily recognize, so 1818, 1831, readily recognize that as Gothic, and Dracula, 1890s, right? We readily recognize that as Gothic, but there's always been kind of this gap in the middle. Well, I would argue that a lot of the strange factory tales are actually fill that gap and also move us from castles and churches into the urban environments that we see in Dracula and in later Gothic. And of course, the Gothic exists to this day. Like people are still writing Gothic novels and Gothic stories.
You see books coming out contemporarily, like we have Mexican Gothic.
It's so good.
It's
I highly recommend it.
It's a good one. That's a good one. Yeah. Anything that has to do with fungus.
Yes, it's that is the scary trope du jour, right?
Yeah.
Fungus everywhere. Yeah,
it's there. We got Last of Us coming out right now. That's it's like anything spooky around a corner.
Yep.
So you talk about that gap specifically in your book Industrial Gothic, and you began talking about it just now when you're referencing, okay, the factory tales are what fill in that gap. I think that sort of brings us into the concept of industrial Gothic. So one of the things that you talk about in the book is the industrialization of Gothic literature. And I was really taken with this idea of industrializing literature, because we see industrialization everywhere, especially I would say as residents of Lowell, we live in a relic of industrialization. So I was wondering if you could tell us about the process of what happens when Gothic literature industrialized. What are we talking about when we talk about industrial Gothic?
Yeah. One is a big transformation of setting, right? So we're no longer locking women up in an individual woman. In the classic Gothic, an individual woman is locked up in a castle or in a crypt or inside a church dungeon or something. So usually it's one girl and she's being victimized by one man, and that's sort of the typical old archetypal Gothic. But in industrial Gothic, if we think about Lowell and we think about all of these young women who are I'm seeing nodding and I love it, thank you. But you see all these young women who come to Lowell, they work in these factories, huge numbers of them. And so it's not this one girl alone in a tiny compartment, it's lots of girls in huge rooms. But the kind of power differential that they experience, the way their lives are controlled and contained, that's where I see the Gothicism coming up. And so industrializing Gothic, what I mostly am referring to is transferring the Gothic concept of women in jeopardy, women as victims of powerful overlords, if you will, but putting that in an industrial setting. So in the world of factories instead of in the world of churches and castles and things. At the same time, because of industrialization, right, there's an explosion of print culture. So you've got books are being mass produced very cheaply. I brought a few examples to show later on. We can do show and tell.
They're really cool.
So yeah, these little cheap pamphlets that like anybody can buy, even a factory girl can buy this, right? And so as you have the spread of not just literacy, but the means to purchase cheap or borrow, or circulating libraries as well are on the rise at this time. All of these things are also about industrializing the Gothic, right? That suddenly you have this new spread of the genre.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really fascinating because when we're talking about these factory girls coming in and becoming the exploited workforce, which thankfully that's in the past. We don't experience
doesn't happen at all anymore.
There's a lot of different sort of branches of how those mill girls are exploited and policed in different ways. So I'm drawn to the story of when Charles Dickens came to visit Lowell, and one of the things that he commented on was how well dressed the girls were, and how that was seen as those girls being promiscuous rather than financially independent. And then building off of that with other things, a factory girl could be anywhere from 6 to 30, and unmarried 6 to 30, and that I'm like, okay, that's so many people. That's such a wide breadth. So the I guess what I'm getting at is how do we define the Gothic heroine in this context? When we're looking at, okay, all of these different narratives of these girls working in the factories, how does that sort of manifest in the literature of the time?
Yeah. So Gothic heroine more generally is usually a woman who secretly is of means, but she either is hiding it or doesn't know it. So a classic Gothic heroine would be someone who actually is of the upper class, but she has been orphaned or somehow had her wealth or station stolen from her. And then later at the end of the novel, her true status is revealed. And there's an interesting and troubling class thing that goes on with that. But we actually see that come through as well in a lot of factory stories where it turns out that a girl is orphaned, but she's actually from an upper class family, and she ends up going to work in the factories. She's a model worker, and then she's redeemed at the end. And so I feel like that's one of the borrowings that factory Gothic novels steal from the Gothic. The other thing is they are often, both in the fiction and at times in real life, victims of multiple kinds of predation, right? So some of it is about exploiting their labor, right? Making them work long hours, not paying them enough. Some of it is about sexual harassment and sexual exploitation as well. And we see this, you alluded to it a little bit there. There's a huge outpouring of interest in the sexual morality of mill girls. In particular here in Lowell, this rhetoric wasn't quite as common in England, although you see some of it, but it really becomes a big deal here in Lowell and in America, where mostly women are in the factories. The key difference being in England, they were mostly employing families. There are definitely mill girls there as well, but your average factory had a range of workers, whereas in Lowell, it's all young women. And so there's this implication that these women are here and they are up to no good. And this ends up being validated in part by some very high profile and very terrible stories of women who die due to unsafe abortion, women who are killed by lovers, women who end up dead and bodies hidden because they were pregnant, and this was unacceptable at the time, right? So these stories end up being fictionalized. We have a bunch of examples of fictionalized versions of them, of real stories of them, and they circulate very, very quickly because this kind of story, I mean, much like true crime today, if you think of the podcasts, your white woman victim, that's what these women were. They fit that mold very well. And so that really captured a lot of imagination and then fueled even more anxiety about the kind of dangers that these women were in.
I love the point of making the connection between true crime and the Gothic heroine and the Gothic victim. I was like, I have to write that down really quickly.
No, it's definitely there. And these stories, there's I have one of them here. So this is 1833, and this is the Sarah Cornell murder. She is murdered by a reverend, Reverend Ephraim Avery, and he makes her death scene look like a suicide. And they find out later she was pregnant, and they find out later, after multiple autopsies, they determine that content warning, that suicide, a lot of physical violence, the particular knot that she was hanged by was not one that she could have killed herself with. It wouldn't have worked. And so someone else inflicted this wound after she was already dead, and likely Ephraim Avery. But it fits like all the true crime examples, and it comes out. So this is a novelization of it. There are transcripts of it. There is a wax museum in Salem, Massachusetts, home of many hauntings. There is a wax museum display of Sarah Cornell and her murderer, Ephraim Avery. And we actually know that from his diary, Nathaniel Hawthorne went and saw it. So it has all these like ridiculous resonances, but it fits all of the true crime things with sensational, kind of over the top. The popular culture was really feeding on these stories. And this is 1833, so it's one of the earliest ones. And we see it all the way into the 1870s with other real stories that happened, but then the same reproducing of fantastical fiction that borrows on the real stuff. Yeah,
and you make this connection to popular culture and how that all wraps up, and it's like, okay, this is entertainment. It makes me think about the corpus of text that you use for this book, because in your introduction, you make a note of addressing that the texts, or many of the texts that you are using, may not meet a certain standard of literariness in regards to what you're drawing on. And you even provide a list of like, okay, I'm not going to talk about this book, and I'm not going to talk about this book. I'm not going to talk about this one. I am going to talk about all of these other things. And so I was wondering if you could expand upon, in this context, what do you mean by the standard of literariness, and what did you foreground in opposition to the books? It's like, okay, these books are not the ones that I'm going to be focusing on.
Yeah, thank you for that question in particular, because you mentioned Charles Dickens a moment ago, and I always twitch a little bit about him because he gets lots of coverage, and I don't know, he makes me a little upset sometimes. So I will step back from that and say, I don't talk about hard times, even though it's clearly a classic Gothic industrial novel. It would fit really well. There are quite a few of the classic Condition of England novels. They're all covered really well in the scholarship, and they all happen to be written by men. And I think that that's an interesting way that certain stories have been set up, that they've been issued in hardcover, nice volumes, that they get reprinted with new introductions, that they get taught regularly in classes on the Victorian novel historically. But I think, there's room for change and revision. And I think in recent years in particular, there's been recovery of texts that were in fact quite popular in their own time, but later generations of scholars ignored them for a variety of reasons, maybe because they were written by women, because they seemed too scandalous, because they weren't appropriate for the classroom. So I don't cover a lot of the big classic industrial novels that folks know, even though I think they would fit my rubric really well. I really tried to focus on writing, number one, if it was by an actual worker. It's harder to find, but there were a lot of women here in Lowell, actually, who were writing. And so I really tried to foreground those, as well as generally women, even if they weren't working women. A lot of the authors that I focus on here are women, many of them working class. The other thing is there's a lot of anonymous writing. We don't know who wrote it. And that makes it sometimes harder to write about as a literary scholar, because you can't make certain claims about where it came from or what motivated it. But I tried to embrace that as well. So the thing that you'll see a lot of in here is discussion of poetry broadsides, which is a very ephemeral, it's literally a piece of paper with a poem written on it. They aren't discussed a lot, partly because they're ephemera, right? They've literally fallen to pieces, so we don't have them. You have to go to places like the Center for Lowell History or the American Antiquarian Society, but they're amazing, and they were popular culture at the time. They were the Instagram of the day. People were, passing these around. They were singing the lyrics of the poems. They were shared popular culture, and so I was really interested in what mattered to these folks at the time. And it would have been newspaper poetry. It would have been cheap little paperbacks like this that working people could purchase and have. Literally, we know that some of the mill girls in Lowell pasted up broadsides and pages of books on their looms. They weren't supposed to read during working hours, but they did. Seems really dangerous. But
thankfully, that was the only dangerous thing that they were doing at the time.
Yeah. I'm sure that was the only kind of danger they were ever in. So I like the idea of thinking about what were they reading, what were they enjoying, and what spurred them to write their own. Right here in Lowell, right, we have the Lowell Offering. Feel like most people here in Lowell have heard of it, right? The girls, it's written entirely by women who worked in the mill, first of its kind, 1840 to 1845. There are other magazines and journals that have working people's writing, but this is the first that really emphasizes that it's all women, it's all workers, and their stuff is amazing. And yet it's not, I didn't know about it till I moved here, and I think it holds up as well as anything by our friends down the road, Emerson and Thoreau, right? So Concord and the Transcendentalists, like they're anthologized. They're in. I'm holding like an American literature anthology in my hand.
That's the concise version.
Right? That's the one volume, right? And Emerson and Thoreau and your fancy Concord people are always in there, but Lucy Larcom should be in there, right? And newer anthologies are doing that, but I really tried as much as possible to foreground women writers, working class writers, and also, like I said, things that maybe weren't published as in book form. So newspaper poetry, broadsides, journals, things that you really have to dig into archives to actually get.
Yeah, you're not just going to walk down to Barnes & Noble and be like, oh,
no.
They have the latest Larcom.
Sadly, no, not today. But I wish we did. I wish you could just walk into the Barnes & Noble and get a Lucy Larcom. No, instead I'm like down at the Center for Lowell History asking them for yet another folder of like these newsprint pieces or going to the microfilm and looking through page after page of newspapers, or asking actually Dan Bazarian here is one of my research assistants who helped me work on this, and he read many pages of newspaper articles as well. So yeah, digging into those sources.
What I love about archival work is you tend to have to walk into the archive with a hunch. And a very helpful resource librarian.
Yes.
And say like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I know exactly. We have tons of those, or we have never heard of that.
Right.
And it tends to be those opposites of the spectrum. And it's like, oh, okay, you're doing this niche thing. Yes, you've come to the perfect library, or we don't even have books written in English here.
No, it's true. The ups and downs of archival work. A huge shout out here to the Center for Lowell History. Actually, also the National Parks has a huge collection of letters that are great, and fantastic people at both of those places who helped me find things. You mentioned like going into the archive with a hunch. So some days I definitely went in with a hunch, but the other thing is letting the archive show you what you need to know. And so sometimes you page something and something very unexpected comes up. So if I may digress on this archive talk, it was actually at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, and I paged something. Literally, I just paged anything that had Factory Girl in it and said, bring it all to me. And so I have this table full of stuff, and there's this a broadside, and it was called "The Man in the Waterproof Cape." And what it was, I talk, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. That's right, because you've read it.
I read the book.
It's so delightful to know that someone has read your book. I'm just going to say that. Thank you, Jack. So the Man in the Waterproof Cape has a little picture, a little like medallion figure of a girl. And underneath it is a poem that details the exploits of the man in the waterproof cape. And the man in the waterproof cape has been going through Lowell and Lawrence and other factory towns wearing only a waterproof cape and harassing the factory girls. He's an exhibitionist. He's a flasher. This is what he is doing. He's literally like stalking the streets of Lowell. And I thought, what a strange thing to write a poem about. This is very odd. And also a poem that you've printed as a broadside. So your idea is that this is going to be like lots of people are going to buy this, that this is something you buy them for like a penny or two, right? And that this would be popular. And I thought, how could that possibly be? What an incredibly, and it also suggests that, well, really, just one of the girls should just marry him and he would get over this. So there's all sorts of really troubling rhetoric going on about how the factory girls should resolve this situation.
How is this the women's fault?
Yes, yeah. And they're just too pretty. That's the problem. There's too many of them and they're too pretty. And so he can't do anything but walk around in his waterproof cape. And
then turn a profit on it.
Yeah, it was so I was baffled by this thing and couldn't believe it. And at that point, I went to several different databases, newspaper databases, and just everywhere I went started typing in man in waterproof cape. And unfortunately, a lot of advertisements for waterproof capes and waterproof clothes came up. So I spent a long time on bad leads. But eventually, between the database searching and help from students and looking at endless newspapers, he was a real guy, possibly multiple real guys that were in fact literally going to different industrial towns and following women. You're talking about a city like Lowell where you have a high density of women. They're out shopping in the evenings after they're working. The cases flare up in late fall, early winter, so you can imagine it's getting darker earlier. The women are getting out of work. And multiple newspaper reports. It starts to be a little hysterical, actually, how many of them are reported actually across the country. They start talking about the man in the waterproof cape. And once you know what to look for and what keywords to find, I found at least 100 different accounts of this from 1870 all the way up through 1890. So a 20-year period during which either there's one guy or there's multiple guys or there's copycats, or it's not quite clear what was really happening. So this was a sort of random thing that I paged. To the best of my knowledge, the American Antiquarian Society has the only copy of this broadside that exists. As far as I know, I haven't been able to find it in any other archive. So the somewhat randomness of this and my unrelenting need to find this, I still occasionally find a new article. I'll get access to a new newspaper. I'm like, oh, there he is again. And so there's this figure.
It's the worst Where's Waldo game.
It is. Oh, it's bad. Yeah. So sometimes the archive presents you with problems to solve. And I felt like that was one of mine. That was definitely something that kicked this off, because I was trying to imagine the circumstances in which this horrible thing is happening and someone decides to write a funny poem about it, and it apparently makes a ton of money. So there's actually a newspaper article saying that many thousands of copies of this poem were sold. And so to imagine that was the case, again, made me come back to, there's something here about Gothic and industrialization, and that unfortunately the man in the waterproof cape made me pretty confident that I could dig into this more. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, that's revolting.
Yes, it truly.
That is revolting. Oh, man. Okay, so I do want to take a moment now and say, if anyone has a question for Dr. Bridget Marshall, we have a couple different avenues through which you can ask a question. There's obviously the raising your hand. That's always a classic here. But we have a microphone up here if anyone has the inkling or of an inquiry that they'd like to come up and talk. But if you don't want to come up and talk to the microphone, we do have papers in the back with our friend the Golden Skeleton, that if you wanted to write down your question and bring it up, that's totally acceptable here as well. We'll hold for a second.
Happy to take questions, but no pressure.
Of course. Brilliant.
Well, I'll just sit in the discomfort. Oh, I see a question. No, so Sarah's asking about sensation as a term, like in Victorian fiction. It's definitely here. And a lot of folks would argue that there's a sort of Venn diagram of sensation fiction and the Gothic. So the Gothic would tend towards the darker side, usually like ending in death and maybe a lot of darker and more terror. But sensation fiction is definitely playing on some of the same kinds of emotions, right? So sensation fiction is about having heart-fluttering emotions, right? One of the books that I write about is Mary Braden's The Factory Girl, and her famous novel is Lady Audley's Secret, and that is sort of held up as a classic of sensation fiction. It has intrigue and secret backstories and things that are being revealed. Usually it's serialized fiction, so part of the sensation is that things are drawn out, like like today when they only release one episode of a series at a time and you can't binge watch it, right? That's a different kind of sensation than getting to sit down and watch all of something at once. So sensation fiction was also playing on sort of dragging out cliffhangers and those sort of moments. Sensation fiction also kind of was used pejoratively, I would say, by the Victorians to say, this is causing sensations in readers that they shouldn't be having, right? There's a lot of fear about reading, particularly about middle and lower class women who are reading the wrong books, right? They're not reading high class literature. They're reading these things that are about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. No, not quite that, but they're reading about the naughty things and that their sensations, they're feeling sensations, and I think there's a lot of implications about sexual feelings, right, that they might have while reading that are inappropriate, and that's used then to accuse this literature of being bad and inappropriate, and to accuse the readers of enjoying that too much. Often associated with cheap literature as well. So Braden, for instance, writes at a breakneck pace. She's just publishing serial after serial after serial. And so it also becomes a way to say, to brush something off and say, this isn't valuable. This is just about sensation. Does that help? Yeah. So yeah, I think quite a bit of the factory fiction could also be called sensation fiction.
Yes, Wednesday.
Before Wednesday.
Hi. So I understand that this sort of like looks at factory settings in a historical sense in the 1800s, and sort of applies all these like Gothic tropes to them. Do you see any other sort of industrial Gothic coming out like in contemporary settings, such as like, because the factory, right, like I feel like has sort of shifted as this sort of American piece of architecture and is outsourced a lot of times. So, it's outside the country. So I'm curious if there's any literature that like you see coming from outside the U.S. and also if there's sort of like a new way that you could see Gothic being applied to, our current sort of environment. Yeah.
Thank you, Wednesday. This is a great question, and I would say, yeah, there's a ton of contemporary resonances here, right? We have shifted so much manufacturing out to other countries where we are distanced from the often really terrible conditions, right? And when I say we, I'm like me, a middle-class white woman in Lowell, right? I don't see what is happening for laborers who are in unregulated places, right, where there aren't protections in place physically for workers or for their time or to prevent them from being exploited. So the Gothic, in part, is about confronting things that have been hidden from you. And so I think recognizing that, garment industries, right, textile industries, the fast fashion industry is trying to hide things from you. And it's trying to show you this nice, pretty, shiny thing, which we love, right? It's fun to put on. It's fun to dress up. But it's hiding something really dark. And there's one of the novels, Edith Hawthorne, that I talk about, has this amazing passage where the narrator speaks directly to the reader and says, my reader, and the author assumes that it's a female readership, and look at your lovely dress, and do you see that tiny dot of red on your dress? That's actually the blood of the worker, and refers to all the variations in color. Oh, that's the tears of the worker, and oh, do you see how your crinoline moves so ever so gently? That quaking is the quaking of the nerves of the poor girl who had to weave this piece of fabric. And it's really trying to embody like what you're wearing on your body right now came from bodies that were exploited and damaged. And so trying to confront that reality, I think, is really what the Gothic's trying to do. At least the best of the Gothic, right? That it is actually trying to make us see things that we've conveniently or by design haven't seen. I sort of think a little bit, I know it's a little bit discredited, but Mike Daisy's work on looking at what happened with the iPhones in China a while ago, he did an expose, and some of his descriptions of that come up in his interviews. There's also a really great, it's a contemporary piece. It's Karen Russell's Reeling for the Empire. It's a contemporary piece of fiction, but it is portraying workers at a silk mill in the 1800s. So it's historical fiction, but in this silk mill, because she does sort of magical realism, there's always something just a little bit off and supernatural in her stories. And in her story, you go to the silk mill and everything seems like a regular standard exploitative mill situation. But in fact, what happens when you work at this silk mill is you are literally turned into a silkworm. And so the women's bodies, they drink this tea and they're transformed into silkworms, and that's how they spin the yarns. And it's just such an amazing take. It's an amazing factory Gothic story that's, engaging, I think, with the real terrible practices in textile manufacturing, and then setting it in this off-kilter kind of world.
That's from Vampires in the Lemon Grove. You would really like that book.
It's really, highly recommend.
Yeah.
All of her stuff is great, but Vampires in the Lemon Grove, yeah.
There's a story where all of the U.S. presidents turn into horses when they die. So it's just like, if you just doing nothing else one evening, just sit down, read some Karen Russell. It's a really good time. Yeah. Fantastic. So I was curious about a point that you had made earlier, where you had mentioned a factory girl had part of a broadside affixed to her loom. Yeah. And she was reading it. And it makes me think about this story you tell, or relay, towards the end of the book, with this cotton goblin or cotton ghoul in an English mill, where it's this monster that the mill workers invented as a means of keeping the children awake by scaring them so they can continue to work. And so I was interested in how the narrative, or Gothic narratives, sort of interrelate with workspaces, where in some instance we have, okay, this is a story and this is on a loom and it's keeping the worker entertained, and then you have another fabricated story that's used as a means of regulating the workforce. So I was wondering if you had anything that you could say about, okay, how the Gothic story interrelates with the actual lived lives or the work lives of these workers.
Yeah. And I'm forgetting the name of my guy so there's a diary from a British worker that Jack's talking about, and he starts working as a small child, and he isn't writing when he's a child, so he's an adult writing back, reflecting on what happened to him. And what he remembers is that the way that they kept the young kids awake, like they were exhausted, they're working these very, very long hours, but the way they kept them awake is that they manufactured a cotton ghoul, like a monster that they made out of cotton, and they had it like surprise them and keep these poor children awake. And I'm reminded of the skeleton actually right now at the back of the room here, like it's kind of scaring me, right? He's keeping me alert. But yeah, I think, Jack, the idea that, we bring these scary stories in, the idea that we would bring a scary monster into a cotton mill as a way to stay awake, a little it's making the Gothic maybe a little too present. I'm probably pushing it to claim that the mill girls understood their lives as Gothic. I don't think that they did. I don't think they, by and large, like on a day-to-day basis, we're like, oh, I'm a Gothic victim. I don't think that's what was going on, but they were certainly reading Gothic novels. We know that a lot of the mill girls in Lowell, from their diary entries, we know that they read Gothic novels. They were interested in Gothic novels. We know that they wrote scary stories, little horror stories, little creepy pieces of Gothic poetry, I would argue. So to that extent, it was part of their lives. But yeah, there's sort of a push-pull here. I really push the factories as dark and creepy, but lots of folks have argued that when young women came to Lowell, this was opportunity for them. And I don't want to deny that that is a reality, right? They were living difficult lives on farms as well. So I don't want to pretend that they were like eating bonbons and relaxing all day and then they had this terrible life, right? They had hard lives on farms and then they had hard lives again here. And in some ways, other scholars have argued that the girls being together in community was important. And I do think that's significant, right? So they're living in boarding houses, they're working with women, they're suddenly with women their own age. And when I think of how exciting and empowering that could be, that's an exciting aspect of things, right? It also becomes exploited on the other hand. And in particular, as conditions get worse in Lowell over the years, and then eventually as immigrants come in and are treated more poorly than the Yankee farmers' daughters of the original group, right? There's a shift there. I think there's a lot that was good for the girls, but there's also, I think sometimes in Lowell, we have tried to focus on the Lowell offering, and the girls had pianos because Charles Dickens said that they had a piano, and they were dressed so nicely, but not above their station. That was what he said. I always have to add that to the piece. They were dressed lovely, but not above their station, because he's still British, very concerned about station, right?
They were dressed nicely, but not in a creepy way.
Right. It was okay. So I think we often focus on those things, but there's a lot of darkness too. The fact that the company was in charge of your workspace and also in the early decades in charge of your home space, right? So you had to live in a boarding house that was owned by the factory that you worked for. The boarding house keeper had to report to the factory if you didn't go to church, right? These are some serious levels of control that, sure, maybe some of the girls were fine with it, but when you imagine your life being that controlled by, I'm not okay with that, right? Which mirrors, unfortunately, some of the panopticon type surveillance culture that we have now in workplaces and in some educational settings.
So that makes me think about the third chapter of Industrial Gothic, where you talk about the carceral Gothic and the cotton industrial complex. Now, you make the points of saying, okay, these girls, even saying it now, their personal lives and their work lives are under surveillance, under control by the people who own and manage the factories and mills that they're working in. And there is a lot of talk about freedom, how freedom manifests in these women's lives. And so one of the things you talk about in depth is this concept of the white slave trope that comes up a lot. And I was wondering if you could speak to that trope.
Yeah. So we have some tidbits of newspaper articles. Sometimes it's in the Lowell Offering, but one of the classic ones is there's a protest song that's recorded in writing, not audio. Sorry to be confusing there. Where the girls who are walking out in one of the strikes in Lowell insist, "We will not be white slaves." And given that slavery in the American South is a real thing at this time in particular, it's a very powerful and troubling imagery that they're using. The girls in Lowell, many of them objected to the term strenuously. They did not want to be associated with the idea of slavery. They wanted to insist, we are white women, we are the daughters of Yankee farmers. At the same time, many of them were ardent abolitionists, right? There were many girls who were involved in the abolitionist cause. So they understood that their fight was related in this way, but there was sometimes some slippage, I think, in that rhetoric. At the same time, people who were buying and selling slaves and owning enslaved people, they loved the term white slave because it enabled Southern plantation owners, right, enslavers, to say, hey, Yankee people, stop worrying about us down here. Why don't you worry about your white slaves up north? And so Southerners would frequently deflect critiques of abolitionist approaches, right, to what they were doing by saying, maybe you should worry about the conditions in your factories because you have turned these white women into slaves. So this is where the rhetoric ends up, right? And the women working in Lowell don't want that association to happen in general. And certainly Lowell's manufacturers don't want that association to be made either. What I try to argue is that these women's lives are intimately involved in slavery, right? They are weaving cotton here in Lowell in particular, right? They are weaving cotton that is grown and harvested by enslaved people, and they know this, right? This is not a secret, and so they have to face that. Lucy Larcom has an amazing poem that she writes about this, and she considers her sisterhood with enslaved women in the South, really engaging with this, and she refers to the Merrimack running red with the blood that is shed in this process, which has an interesting sort of double imagery, since the Merrimack sometimes did run red because of the toxic dyes that we were pouring into it. So there are definitely, Lucy Larcombe Park has a couple of her poems. There's one that's around a tree. If you get in the little park that's in the middle of Lowell High, there's a tree that has a poem on it, around it in like a metal fence. And it's one of Larcombe's poems. And it's really engaging with that idea and trying to make explicit that we've got the exploitation of the workers in the factory, but an even more serious harm is being done in terms of the raw materials that we are using that are being, that are supporting the transatlantic slave trade and enslavement.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
To put it mildly.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so there are several years in which Lowell published this little grid, and you can get it, it's in the Library of Congress. I think we have copies of it here. And it lists down the left-hand side, it's all of each of the individual mills in Lowell, and then it has all this data like, how many yards of this they put out, how many women they employ, how many men they employ, the wages. It's like this amazing data dump. And there's a column that says what each mill makes. And if you zoom in on it, right in the middle of one of them, and I'm forgetting which mill it was, but it says Negro cloth right there. Like no one was trying to hide that. This was a cash crop, right? That they were making a lot of money. So you're right. They are getting cotton from these southern plantations, and then they are sending back a finished product that they're making more money off of. There's a great book that I'm not going to remember the name of, about the Rhode Island family, that their primary dark something, I'll try to get that name, sorry, but that really looks at that circle of trade and how it becomes another huge profit for the mill owners. Thank you for bringing that up.
So moving forward through the book, if we're talking about different intersections, if we'll call it intersections, you move forward with talking about disability and disfigurement at length in the book, which I think is important to talk about, because disability and disfigurement, even as you put in the book, many Gothic tropes and narratives rely on the idea of disability and disfigurement to establish themselves or to punish or signify different characters. So I was wondering if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, so a lot of Gothic would have a villain that is marked in some way, right? We see this as a trope even today in movies, right? Where you have someone with a lisp, someone with a facial disfigurement,
an eye patch,
right? Or a missing limb, right? And that this becomes a signal of this person's villainy. It suggests that villainy and evil is embodied, and that physically different people are physically wrong and mentally wrong, right? It's wrapped up in all sorts of ableist discourse. So I point that out pretty clearly, right? At the same time, some Gothic texts suggest, push a little bit on that. So Frankenstein is sort of a classic here. Frankenstein's creature is, in fact, more powerful and more able-bodied than his creator, right? He is physically he was much stronger and bigger. And in fact, there's nothing really, I'm going to put in quotation marks, wrong with him other than he's ugly and looks different and scares people. And so we can look at this as the social model of disability, right? So the medical model of disability says there's something wrong with this person's body that has to be fixed in particular. And if it can't be fixed, then it's unsalvageable. So that's how Victor looks at the creature. But the social model of disability would say, no, actually, there's nothing wrong with the creature. The problem is that everybody around him freaks out when he shows up, right? There's nothing wrong about him. And so some Gothic does start to push a little bit on that idea of disability. So in this book, I talk about the Industrial Revolution's an interesting place to be thinking about disability, because some folks would argue that the Industrial Revolution is actually what makes disability as a concept. So people certainly had what we would now call disabilities earlier than that, but they weren't maybe identified in that way. Some folks talk about the fact that if you had, say, a different limb or a missing limb or some kind of physical impairment, that you likely were still, you might not have been treated kindly. I'm not trying to say that everything was fine, but you were likely still integrated into household work. So if your family made cloth, you were probably still participating in that in some way, perhaps in some augmented or different way. Maybe you sat down at home to work on a loom versus standing. But what happens as you move to industrial production is industrial production needs bodies that are the same and that fit in the same place, so that when you, the weaver who stands here, get hurt and can't work anymore, we literally put a different person right in that same spot. And we're not going to change the machinery or do anything different with it, right? And so it suggests that bodies have to be the same and uniform in order to work, at the same time that the nature of industrial production is injuring people and maiming people and making them sick so that they can't do that. And so it's a particularly vicious cycle, because they need these perfect bodies even more so than they did before, because these machines are made in such a way. But we're disabling these bodies so that they can't participate, which means we use more people up. And literally, they're a resource as much as the cotton that they're making. That they're using people as resources. Yeah. It's people, right?
Oh, that's terrible. Anyway, just moving on, which is, it is, because I'm very curious about the I grew up in Massachusetts. At the fifth grade, they take us to the Lowell Mills and they say a child would use their perfect tiny hands to reach into this dangerous machine and either fix it or lose the hand. And then they expect us to go about our days normally. So I am curious about, okay, records of workers who get injured on the job. Are there any instances in which, okay, part of this worker is, to put it bluntly, salvaged, or are they just out on the streets? Are there histories of integrating with disfigured workers who are still, in other respects, able-bodied, to continue working this production line?
That is a great question, and I have not been able to find specific examples in Lowell, partly because we don't have a lot of the records, or they're dispersed enough, or they weren't written about enough. There's a couple of folks, David Blackie, and I'm going to forget the second person's name, but they're in England, and they've done a ton of work on coal mining and disabled bodies in the coal mining industry that suggests that, and that was an incredibly dangerous field, and that suggests that people who were disabled, who had incidents of maiming, who had lost limbs, that they were still brought back to work, typically in different capacities, and they typically were paid less, which sadly seems, oh yeah, that tracks. But that they continued to be part of the workforce, partly perhaps by necessity, right, in order to support themselves. So there's definitely documentation. There are a couple, there's a British book on Robert Blinko, and he starts off working very young, and he has an autobiography, and he is severely debilitated by the way his legs are injured. And he continues working throughout his life in great physical pain, we should emphasize. But there definitely are people who are continuing to work. We also, in fiction, there's pejorative term, hunchback is a repeated character that you'll see in factory fiction, where you have typically a woman who is hunched over because of the kind of work that they've been doing. So we certainly see integration of people with certain kinds of disabilities. But oftentimes, so if you're talking about the first generation of mill girls, you probably were sent home, right? If you had a debilitating injury, you were sent back to the farm, where who knows what was going to happen. Were you going to be integrated into farm life? Were you going to be an object of pity? It's not quite clear.
It's heavy.
Yeah.
It's heavy.
Yeah.
So, which brings me to one of the things I absolutely love about Industrial Gothic is the way it connects to contemporary society. And it's something that Wednesday had brought up earlier. Because I find that there's a lot of literary criticism that you read it and it's a little so what after that. So this really elaborate, well-crafted literary critique, and I still walk away being like, okay, how does that affect life in some way? What do we learn? What do we come away with a new sense of belonging? And so I like, I adore how in Industrial Gothic, there are all these connections to, okay, this is a problem, and here is the ramification that we have in the modern day, or here's the inference that we can make from that. So one of the things I'm wondering if, and you could say no, is how does understanding of these tropes of the Industrial Gothic sort of help us or inform us in the modern day? What could we learn from Industrial Gothic that we could incorporate into maybe our work lives moving forward?
Yeah. Well, I think some of it is the idea that you could be having an experience that seems very mundane, like working at a factory, right? Just like a repetitive thing. But because of its nature, even if you're not physically in danger, that the repetitive, ongoing, mind-numbing thing can in itself be a horror, right? Can be something that is really terrifying. And I think that the Gothic is one way to help dig into that, and right, think about the implications of, oh, what if I am just doing this repetitive thing all day? And in some ways that can apply to not just factory labor. Like, what are the stakes of the labor any of us are doing, right? That maybe is a piece of it. I think there's also something about, I mentioned that the original Gothic is about one girl in danger, and in the Industrial Gothic we see a whole huge number of women in danger. And I do think there's something notable about the power of numbers there, right? We know here in Lowell that women organized. We know that one way to push back against terrible, dangerous, exploitative labor conditions is through organizing and unionization efforts. And I think those are important ways to think about pushing back against like the Gothic conditions at times of labor, of capitalism, of just the way we've unfortunately set up our economy and society. So I think that's a piece of it. I think we can also just learn a lot from thinking about the stories that we have excluded. So, we like to talk about the mill girls of Lowell and their pianos and their nice dresses and how pretty they looked when they walked down the street when the president came to visit. But we maybe don't like to face the darkness. And so I think actually looking at the darkness and saying, what is going on in that dark corner over there? What is going on in that factory over there? That we need to make ourselves aware of it. I think that is another piece of what I hope people take as a modern day implication. We can't just let that stuff keep going on in the shadows, right?
And you make a wonderful point, I feel like, about modern day Lowell, where the factory girls of Lowell feel more like a branding thing now more than a tragic piece of history, where it's something that's like, you point to it when you learn it in history class and say, hey, that's us. I didn't know we were in this one. And understanding it's like, no, okay, it's important to know your history, but also this is why it could save your life. Yeah. Which is, I think, wonderful. I now want to open it up one more time. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Marshall, before we begin to wrap up. Jake?
Yeah, so you pinpointed the focus of the novel kind of between the two peaks of Gothic literature.
Yeah.
Something that also happens during this time is a rise of like the labor movement in America. And I was wondering if at all that plays a part in this sort of factory Gothic, because we kind of look at unions and labor movements now as their own kind of devil. I was wondering if maybe there's a different side here, more sympathetic towards labor organizing.
That is interesting, and I haven't explored that enough. But I do think so. Seth Luthor is one of the activists who's trying to change things in Lowell in the 18. I'm going to not say the year because I can't remember. And he writes this treatise on here's what's happening in Lowell, and it is filled with this over-the-top Gothic imagery, right? He's trying to get through to people. So I think maybe one piece of this, I'm not sure that this gets to what you're saying, but labor organizers and activists understood that there was a power in this kind of imagery, right? In showing people the the gory horrors of what was going on, and so they could use that rhetoric in a way to get people to care, right? To get people involved in the cause. So I think that's certainly there. There are a couple. Mary Barton is a British industrial novel, and it does have a scene of a strike happening where the workers are compared to Frankenstein's monster. They say Frankenstein's, but it's Frankenstein's monster. Let's be really clear about that.
This has always been a problem.
Suggesting that laborers organizing are monstrous, right? That they don't know what they're doing. It's sort of an idea of the monster rebelling. So I think there are definitely ways that anti-labor rhetoric can be fueled by the Gothic just as easily, right? You have a lot of working class people who are suddenly getting together. That uprising feels terrifying if you are the owner or the proprietor of a business. So I think that's definitely there. That hasn't been my primary angle on this, but I think the story of the rise of labor activism is definitely a piece of this, for sure. Hope that helps.
Would you like to field them?
Go right ahead. Oh, it's like choosing between my children. Favorite story? Yeah. I will say, so this 1833 Fall River, an authentic narrative, which is this fictionalization of the true story of Sarah Mariah Cornell, is definitely one of my favorites in that it's a real story. It's doing true crime, but it's also like over the top using all of these Gothic things. It's walking this weird line of journalism / sensation / Gothic. So I love that. But there's also a lot of small pieces that I found like in the Lowell Offering. There's this wonderful short story called Garfalina. It's strange and bizarre. It's definitely written by a factory girl in Lowell, we don't know who, and she writes this full-on Gothic story about, in quotation marks, gypsies in Hungary, and a back and forth fight between two families with power, and it ends with this terrible massacre of this huge group of girls. And so it's not about factories, but it's written by a factory girl, and I'm just fascinated by the way she's adopting all these tropes, but doing something new with it. So that really got me. I'm trying to think of what else. A lot of it is very silly and over the top. Silly in a dark way, right? Like over the top, like drama queen kinds of stories. So, and I like that. I kind of revel in that a bit. So, yeah, I guess does that help?
Yeah. Are there any like crossovers like what Penny Dreadfuls are?
Yes, absolutely. So, well, we know that the factory workers were reading String of Pearls, which is Sweeney Todd. So there's definitely some factory girl characters there. Actually, my current project is, I mentioned Mary Elizabeth Braden, who wrote Lady Audley's Secret. She also writes this factory girl novel, and it's been out of print since it first appeared. And so Wales University Press put this book out, and they have a new Gothic original series. So they're trying to reissue like Lost and Forgotten Gothic. So I'm working on it right now to bring it out. And it's very long. It's very Braden in that it's got like 18 different side plots and sort of over the top silliness happening. But I guess that is actually my favorite right now because that's the one I'm working on. It's very long in like true Victorian novel fashion. Lots and lots of incidents. It was published serially with tons of cliffhangers. The magazine it was being printed in went out of business mid-run, so they had to start it afresh in a new magazine because that was just the conditions of publication.
It went over
at
to
the time.
Netflix.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the Community of its day, bounced from network to network. So yeah, I like that one a lot. It has this very it also has a happy ending for the factory girl. So I like those ones. But it is another case, however, of a secretly. I'm gonna. Spoiler alert, don't listen if you want to read it and not know what happened. She secretly is upper class, and she was stolen and believed she was an orphan, but she secretly was of the upper class. So she marries the owner of the factory, and everyone's scandalized because she's just a factory girl, but it turns out, in fact, she wasn't just a factory girl. So all kinds of fun, yeah. Mhm.
the man is the predator, a
Yeah.
strong, powerful man. So in your career, in your work that you've done in Gothic,
Yeah.
do you see a gender reversal? Do you see the woman as a predator anywhere and the man being victimized?
Not terribly often. There's a British book, Michael Armstrong, that's about a boy, but he's still a child, truly. But he's the Michael Armstrong, the factory boy. So there are definitely quite a few factory boy narratives, but they're almost always about children, very rarely about men. We do have some adult men. I was just talking with Jack about this before. This great Factory Lives, which is an autobiographies of British factory workers. And so that more frequently is men, because men are being given a voice in the labor movement in particular at this time. So you see many more, particularly in England, autobiographical accounting from adult men who generally, in terms of their victimization, have been physically injured on the job. And so that typically is what has happened. But it is mostly in both the fiction and in the real accounts. What I see is women who are abused by their factory overseer, the factory owner, the son of a factory owner, a visitor who comes. There's a couple where basically a wealthy man comes into the factory to observe because he wants to see what these women do, right? And that he, because he has power and wealth, is able to have free access to these women, to watch them whenever he wants, and then to pull them aside when he is so moved. So I would say it's very consistently male predators, sometimes doctors who make their way into the factory through their supposed medical expertise. There are a couple of women villains, but they're almost always accessories to men. So in the Braden Factory Girl, there's two. There's a terrible half sister who is disowned, and she's trying to get herself back into the family, and her French maid, because the British don't like the French, so it works out well. So these two women are definitely evil characters, but they pale in comparison to like the conniving aristocrat who's doing the main villaining, I would say. But yeah, so that's a good question though. What I mostly see, by and large, these stories focus on women being victimized by men who are in power, which unfortunately largely fits with what we're talking about for the time period.
On a similar question, when you were talking about, the trope of usually it's a woman in peril, I was thinking about horror movies and slasher flicks and whatnot, and how slasher flicks have sort of evolved nowadays, so that something that could be considered perhaps subversive or a little bit of a twist is the woman in peril becomes the hero of the story. And I was wondering, especially because I thought it was really fascinating when you were talking about how the woman in peril stays in peril when she's alone, but when in community has the ability to sort of organize and kind of. Is there any narratives that you've encountered in which the women writers center themselves as perhaps the hero of the stories, or kind of give themselves a little bit of a hero's arc, perhaps their characters even?
Absolutely. So quite a lot of the factory girls do end up surviving at the end. A lot of them die. A lot of side characters die, right? They've had a terrible accident, or they die of shame, or, they have an illegitimate child and have to, disappear from the face of the earth. But there are quite a few. So the Braden one that I just talked about, where she is redeemed at the end. There are definitely some final girls, right? In slasher film lingo, to say the girl who comes back at the end and she fights. She's the last girl standing, and often, is able to overpower the villain or the creep or whoever it is. So we definitely see that. There's one that I really like that I found recently. It's Paul Pimlico. It's American, and it was published in a cheap weekly paper. It's in 5 installments. And at the beginning, there are 3 villains, and I'm going to forget the heroine's name, but it's a factory girl, and there are 3 different men after her. So there is the factory owner, there is a customer of the factory, and there's an overseer. And these 3 men literally get together and have a meeting about how they're going to get the girl, like ruin her, and pass the, she's like, they're discussing her like she's a, you know, an object that they can just pass back and forth. It's truly horrifying. And at the end, sorry, spoiler alert, two of them get in a fight with each other. And one of them dies in that fight because they're fighting over her. And the other one is so ashamed to be associated with this that he has to leave town. And our heroine gets to marry the man of her dreams. So it works out great. But the very end, what happens to her is that they mention, the narrator mentions that every once in a while, however, a darkness comes over her as she recalls the danger that she was in at this time. So there's this interesting way in this narrative, I would argue, that she, even though she survives, she's happily married, her virtue is preserved. She's still haunted, right? That this dark and creepy story is still with her. Her idea of feeling in danger is still there. So I feel like that is kind of a horror story move, right? Like, because there's going to be a episode 2 where Michael comes back, right? So yeah, there's definitely some final girl energy for some of these factory girls. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Bridget Marshall for speaking with us today.
Thank you. And thank you, Jack. And thank you, Wednesday. And thank you, Dan. And thank you, LTC, for having me. I'm very grateful.
Yes. Thanks to the whole team here at LTC. I would like to plug their handle, their socials. One more time, you can find LTC at LTC Lowell MA. I have been your moderator today. My name is Jack, and I want to thank everyone else in the audience here today for coming out. So thank you, and everyone have a wonderful evening.